Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Toni Pace Carstensen. I am chair of the LA Section Vision Committee. And on behalf of the LA Section Vision Committee and LA SIGGRAPH, I'd like to welcome you to today's event. Thank you. But first of all, I want to thank some of the people who made this event possible. First of all, for Google, for Paul Debevec, Senior Staff Engineer, GoogleVR. Yay. And Peter Denny, who is Program Manager for Volumetric Imaging and Light Field. So Peter, please stand up. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Joan Collins, who's Chair Emeritus of LA SIGGRAPH. So Joan, where are you? Can we thank you? Oh. And also Jim Carbonetti, who is an amazing stereoscopic supervisor, member of the VES, and is the one who approached Paul Debevec about doing this event. So thank you. Thank you, Paul. Yay. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Scott Squires. Scott Squires is an Oscar-winning visual effects supervisor, CTO, and co-founder of Pixvana. Pixvana is a company dedicated to creating tools for helping people create immersive experiences. Scott was the CTO at ILM for many years, has multiple Academy Award nominations, including one for Star Wars I: Phantom Menace. Please join me in welcoming Scott Squires.
Thank you very much, Toni. I think the other thing, I would just like to thank Toni because she is the one-woman committee for the Vision Committee and puts these on throughout the years. You know, let's hear it for Toni. So the whole idea of the VES Vision Committee is to try to bring to visual effects people and the VES members new technologies, new ideas, and other things that they can start thinking about and explore as something that they might be interested in getting involved in. So today we have two great speakers. I'll do a full introduction to each of those. They'll each speak for about a half an hour, and we'll take a few questions afterwards. And then once they're both done, I'll get up here and have some questions for them and invite more questions from the audience. But first, Paul Debevec would like to do a history of the building that we're in now. Cool.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Toni and Scott. So it's a thrill that you're all able to come out here today. It's very special and a huge honor to be able to share a little bit of this building. So this is Hangar 15 of Hughes Aircraft company. It's had a very rich history. Some of you, I don't know that much about the history, but I put a couple slides together. Some of you may have, at some point in your careers, shot a movie inside this building or near a building. Can I see a show of hands if anybody? Wow. Okay, very, very good. Let's just hear a couple of the films that have been done. So somebody shot one out. Avatar. Awesome. Very cool. Any George of the Jungle. Very nice. Any Really? Fantastic. Okay, cool. So you know you're in a very historic place. Of course, this whole area was called the Culver City plant by Howard Hughes himself back in the day. This used to look like, who was also, by the way, a filmmaker, an industrialist, a pioneer in aviation, the founder of TWA Airlines, and then most of this area here was built for creating aircraft for World War II. And so obviously, let's see here, we're in this building right here. This building still exists here. This is called Hangar 17. It's now YouTube Space LA. So YouTubers with lots of subscribers actually can access some nice sound stages and camera equipment over there to enhance their production values for what they're doing. Building 21 still exists. We're kind of using that electrical substation and some storage. These seem to be gone and replaced with other stuff. But there's 3 buildings over here that also still exist. And this one is actually a Google building. This is known as Hangar 3. And for people who want to stay for demos afterwards, this is the building that will eventually lead a group over to go see, and we can see a couple of the light field related things over here. So this is going to be about let's see, we're going to walk through the building and then probably like a 7 or 8 minute walk. I'm very familiar with it because we're working over here, but lunch is over here. So every day we're doing this. So I think everyone knows why this particular hangar was originally built, and that was to build the Hercules H-4 airplane, also known as the Spruce Goose. It was dubbed that by the media. It was never called that by Howard Hughes. It's actually made mostly of birch, in fact, but didn't rhyme with anything that made any sense for that. It is a notable aircraft because it is very, very large. You'll notice that there's 8 engines on it. It is, at the time, the world's largest aircraft ever produced. It is still certainly the largest wooden aircraft. It's technically a flying boat. Metal was scarce during the war, so building things out of wood, including this building and the airplane, was definitely the way to go. And amazingly, this is still the largest aircraft in terms of wingspan and height. Although the A380 and the Antonov Russian transport plane are a little bit longer, this is still notably the widest wingspan that you get, 320 feet from wingtip to wingtip. That's longer than a football field, and the same length as our cafe where we have lunch, which is called Cafe 320. I think they intended that to kind of match up. So this was constructed in pieces inside this very building in the early 1940s, and here's a actual photo of some of it. You can recognize some of the building there. A little bit of its depiction in Howard Hughes's overall arc was depicted in the 2004 film The Aviator, which I'm sure most of you have seen. Had some great visual effects supervised by Rob Legato. And there's even a shot in the scene in the movie that shows the Hercules 4 being constructed using a model miniature by New Deal Studios for that. And you would have thought, hey, they use it for shooting films all the time here. If they're going to shoot a scene of Leonardo DiCaprio as Howard Hughes walking by this, well, why not just use this building? You could actually, put in some set pieces, but it was busy shooting other films at the time, or so I'm told. So they did a model miniature and some green screen to put Leo in there. So the war ended, which is a good thing, before the plane was completed or had ever flown. But if you've seen the movie, in 1947, Howard Hughes was getting some flack. Did you waste all of this money on a plane that never got used and probably wouldn't even fly because it's a crazy thing to put together? And so kind of to show everybody that this was a valid thing, they actually took it out of the building. So that's our hangar there, and there's the Spruce Goose coming out of it. And they took it down to Long Beach Harbor, and then they flew it one time on November 2nd, 1947. It was airborne for 26 seconds. Howard Hughes himself piloted it. It made it 70 feet off the water, which technically means it was not free of the ground effect, but anyway. And it got up to 135 miles per hour and went about a mile. So probably not a great payoff for the investment, but proved that the thing could actually go. Howard Hughes actually kept the thing maintained and at the ready for action with a crew of between 50 and 300 people for the next 20 years until his death in 1976, at which point they were finally told that they could go home. It was on display. Did anyone see it in Long Beach when it was under this dome? Apparently in the 80s and 90s you could actually go see it there. I wish I'd gotten a chance to see it there, but eventually it was sold to a museum outside of Portland, Oregon called the Evergreen Aviation Museum. It is in immaculate condition, and you can go visit the Spruce Goose there, learn a bit of its history. If you get the little extra ticket, then you can actually go and sit in the very pilot seat of Howard Hughes's plane. If you really want, they have a hat available for you to truly hues it up. And on display, just under the wing, is that very model made by New Deal Studios of that miniature of it under construction. So you can actually go up there and visit the little model, which is great. Now, if you go, of course, bring your swimsuit, because as it turns out, they have an air museum, a space museum, and then a water park next door, Evergreen Wings and Waves, with a, of course, 747 on top of the building that you can climb up some stairs inside in your bathing suit, and then water slide through the fuselage of the airplane outside the building, and then back into the building, and then dump out in a pool in the middle. I didn't think to bring my suit for that. But so I hope to go back. In any case, that's a little introduction to the building. We will have a chance to walk quickly through the rest of the structure on the way to the demos afterwards, if people are interested. And then I'd like to turn it back to Scott, who's going to introduce our next speaker, talking about some work going on in Google AR.
Thank you, Paul. That was fantastic. Very interesting history there. So our first speaker is from Google as well. Ivan Neulander is the lead rendering engineer on Playground. This is the second iteration of Google's immersive AR camera mode. And that launched the Pixel phone as AR sticker. So Ivan also comes from a visual effects background. He worked for 15 years at Rhythm and Hues, so he's well acquainted with the Visual Effects Society and the rest of it. And so I would invite Ivan to come up and demonstrate and talk about their developments in AR.
So thanks again for the introduction. I'll start with a quick intro of my own. So I'm an engineer on the Playground team. I've been at Google about 5 years now. And I joined Playground when the project kicked off a little less than 2 years ago. I've spent many years at Rhythm and Hues, as Scott mentioned, working on their in-house production renderer, which was used in most of their feature films and commercials. I definitely learned a lot during that period. And I was lucky to be able to apply some of that knowledge toward the many challenges that we met in building Playground. So in this talk, I'll cover some of those challenges and the steps we took to deal with them. So let's start with what is Playground, and here are a few live captures to illustrate that while I talk. So Playground, which was originally branded as AR Stickers, is what's known as a camera mode for Pixel phones, meaning it's an app that you access through the built-in camera, and it shares many of the UI elements with the built-in camera. And the idea behind it is that you place these 3D animated stickers into the camera feed, and they react to one another and also to you, which looks really fun. The stickers are lit and rendered to try to blend seamlessly into the scene. And this is actually quite challenging because we don't have all the required information about the scene. The phone camera only sees a small portion of the scene, and so we need to make lots of assumptions about what is out of view. And I'll get into more of that later. So I'll say a few words about AR Core first. It's Google's multi-platform open source SDK for doing augmented reality, and it's a key component of our app. AR Core's primary objective is tracking the camera pose, planes, and scene lighting. We actually ended up rolling our own scene lighting estimation, and I'll have more to say about that later. AR Core also, as of recently, does background segmentation, which we use in selfie mode in order to composite stickers behind the user. So AR Stickers was renamed to Playground when it launched last October, and it brought a lot of cool new stuff. So there were new content packs, including the Avengers, a lot of new word art, and the so-called 2D stickers, which have animated textures with transparency. There's selfie mode. You see an example of that here. That leverages AR Core's background segmentation. There's emotion detection, so that stickers will detect when you smile and they'll smile with you or react appropriately in other ways. Contextual suggestions based on what the phone camera sees. Also UI and rendering enhancements of many sorts. So I'll go back to the very beginning now and walk you through some of the early prototyping work that we did as we took the first steps toward creating AR stickers in Playground. We decided early on to use Unity because it had most of the building blocks we needed so that we could stand up a prototype quickly and deploy it on Android without a lot of friction. And after really only a couple of months, we had the core elements working, things like placement, deletion, translation. Most of the UI elements were there, basic lighting, and of course video recording, which we knew would be an important part of it from the start. We relied on Tango to emulate ARCore's camera tracking because at the time ARCore actually didn't exist and we didn't have access to Pixel phones. So we used these older Tango phones to emulate that experience. We needed a way to also emulate plane tracking, and we built a UI where the user finds a feature point on the ground and moves the phone while keeping the feature point centered within a circle in the UI, which is pretty crude, but it was sufficient for our purposes to stand up the prototype. And here you see some interactive animations in our prototype. The crabs here respond to the viewer approaching them by aggressively raising their claws. And the alien patrols the grassy area looking for the kitten and then abducts it. Now, neither of these animations are in the final product, but they definitely informed our development of the interactive animations that we did actually ship. For example, the 11 Demogorgon battle I showed earlier. There's also this really neat illumination effect, which was something we prototyped where a sticker can illuminate other stickers and also the camera feed. And this is actually really tricky because it involves amplifying the camera feed, which can create noise, especially when you're trying to amplify something that's very dark, sensor noise in particular. And there's also the fact that the amplified camera feed needs to match the lighting of the synthetically lit stickers, and it's hard to get those two to match. But you know, the basic idea was just to do some shader trick on ground planes that we were placing anyway in order to handle shadowing, and I'll have more to say about that soon. Unfortunately, we didn't finish this in time for launch, but it's something that we've continued to refine and hope to release in a future, hope to add in a future release. So going from prototype to launch, this shows you the progression of the look of our app. And as you can see, many of the UI elements of the prototype were actually carried through right to the launched product. And I think it's a sort of testament to Unity that we were able to put together something that got probably a good 65% of the way to the final launch in such a short period of time. So this is a commercial that you might have seen promoting our AR Stickers launch, as well as the opening of The Last Jedi, which was mid-December 2017. So the stickers you see here were rendered offline by VFX Studio, but they use the same assets as the real app. So the animations, rendering, and sounds are all close to what you get in the app. The stickers here are also kept in the foreground, as is the case with the app.
The force is yours. The Last Jedi AR stickers, only on the Google Pixel camera.
All right. So now I'll tell you a bit more about the basic lighting and rendering of our stickers. So our PBR shader is an Uber shader written in GLSL ES3, which would run very well on all the phones that we were targeting. Initially just the Pixel phone, and later we expanded it to future versions of the Pixel. So that means it's a single shader with different components that can be enabled or disabled through compiler symbols. And so we could turn on or off things like normal mapping, transparency, emissiveness, clear coat, and we could quickly build these different variants to apply to different stickers as needed. It's loosely based on Unity's standard surface shader. We ended up rewriting a lot of the image-based lighting implementation to be more mobile friendly, and we also added a lot of tweaks to make it work better in an AR setting. It's texture driven with a lot of per sticker uniforms, and here you see sort of the left three textures are the ones that basically all the stickers have: an albedo texture, a gloss map that packs together things like roughness, metalness, and ambient occlusion that our shader uses, as well as a normal map. And then there's also an emissive texture that's optional for stickers that glow, like R2-D2, for example. So we decided early on to use image-based lighting for our product. The prototype that we did in Unity just had a pair of directional lights, and as a result, the objects there appeared really harshly lit. You could see very sort of abrupt fall-offs between the lit and the self-shadowed parts, and we knew that that wouldn't look very convincing, trying to integrate CG elements into the camera feed. That kind of motivated our transition to use image-based lighting. Let's first define what we mean by that in the context of our app. So we basically treat all the pixels of a cube map as a set of directional lights, and this concisely forms a very rich lighting environment that we can render efficiently. So AR stickers and Playground, actually AR stickers only, used a desaturated version of this office spark that you see here as the basis for its cube map. And this worked as a stand-in for many indoor and outdoor scenes. For Playground, we ended up updating this to one that has more dynamic range, which gave a lot of variation to the lighting. So how do we use image-based lighting in Playground? There are two components. First, we pre-compute the diffuse and specular reflections from a predetermined environment map. And then we use something called FIBL, or fake image-based lighting, and that's what makes the lighting responsive to the camera feed, and it's what accounts for the difference between the two hamburgers there on the left and makes the turtle go dark as you slide it into the darkened room. And so I'll talk about each of these in turn. So with precomputed lighting, the goal is to construct these so-called pre-convolved textures for diffuse and for specular reflections. These are based on a BRDF weighted average of all the unoccluded incident light from the environment onto a given point on a sphere. And there's a weighting term which represents the BRDF fall off. And it can really be any function, but it has to be rotationally invariant about the normal, meaning isotropic. And so in our case, we basically, for diffuse, we just use the Lambertian fall off, which is just a cosine function. For specular, we index it by the reflection vector. And we used initially a power cosine function, and later we used some other tools to use some other lobes besides just the power cosine that gave a closer match to what the artists were looking for. So the important thing here is that we can do both of these lookups using simple texture hardware and mipmap biasing, which makes the actual lighting extremely inexpensive. And here you see some scenes that are lit using this technique. And simply by changing these pre-convolved textures, we can alter the lighting in very meaningful ways and give the artists a lot of controls. So to summarize, our pre-computed reflections look really nice and they provide lots of detail and visual interest. However, they ignore what the phone camera actually sees. So the lighting becomes kind of divorced from reality. And as I mentioned, these reflections don't account for light occlusion, so things generally look brighter than they should. And so to deal with that, we came up with something called fake image-based lighting, or FIBL. And that's what makes the CG lighting responsive to the camera feed, mainly in terms of overall brightness, but also in terms of local brightness and to some extent color. It's not meant to inject any high-frequency detail from the camera. We have other sources for that. But FIBL complements that. It started out actually as an intern project by Chloe Legendre, who is now a member of Paul's team. And in fact, they're working on a more robust way to infer lighting from the camera feed using a deep learning model trained from real-world light captures. So I'm super excited about incorporating this sort of next generation of light capture into a future release of Playground, because it'll be a huge step up in terms of visual quality. But in terms of what we have right now, so the way FIBL works is we sample a filtered copy of the camera feed, considering a variable-sized region around a sticker. And we use mipmaps to optimize the sampling, as I described. We separate the lighting contribution into an upper and lower hemisphere. The light from below incorporates the color of the reflecting floor surface, so it's fairly accurate. Unfortunately, it also tends to be less relevant because you don't usually see the undersides of stickers that much unless they're really big. The light from above is actually also inferred from the floor pixels, since that's generally all we have. We tend not to see the overhead light sources within the camera's field of view. So we have to work with the reflectance off the floor. So we try to compensate for that. We use a broader filter region. We desaturate the color. We brighten it to compensate for the floor's presumed less than perfectly white albedo. And then these upper and lower hemisphere light estimates are fed into a procedural environment function that multiplies by the pre-convolved texture lookups I talked about. So once we had all that kind of working, there were many levers to tune. We did lots of calibration with a physical 18% gray card, which you see here as the gray oval with the black border. And we also rendered a CG gray sphere next to it with the same 18% albedo. And by juxtaposing these two, we were able to tweak the parameters of our Fibble model until the two objects began to match reasonably well across a lot of different lighting conditions. As you can see, the two rarely match exactly, but they're never too far apart either, which was our goal. So here are some example scenes showing the final lit result with Fibble on versus off to give you a more intuitive sense of what it actually does. If you pay attention to the image on the right, you'll see me switching it back and forth. So this is off, on, off, on. Here's another scene with it off versus on. Yet another scene, off, oops, sorry, on. And one more. So in this last one, we actually see the primary failure mode of Fibble, where it's vastly over-darkening the foreground porg because it happens to be sitting on a dark surface. You can compare it to the nearby chess piece, which is quite bright. So ultimately, Fibble is a really simple approximation. It doesn't hold up under all lighting conditions. On a more positive note, though, this is a sort of a graceful failure in that we err on the side of blending AR objects in with their surroundings rather than making them stand out, even when standing out is the physically correct thing to do. That said, for Playground, we actually did add a feature to give artists a little bit more control over this. It's a kind of a local darkening control, which prevents Fibble from darkening stickers below a certain percentage of the average camera feed. And it's really meant for sort of brightly colored cartoony stickers. It lets them stay consistently bright, but at the same time, it prevents them from glowing in the dark if you put them into a consistently dark environment. And so that's been very useful for some of the later sticker packs that we released. So here's a progression of the effects that we could achieve with Fibble from prototype to launch. So here you're seeing our prototype, which ran on the CPU, implemented in C# no less, and it was really slow, so we could only update a single sticker at a time while it was being manipulated. Other stickers would not respond, even if their lighting were to change. In our final app, Fibble runs on the GPU in a vertex shader for all the stickers, so all the pixels are being updated at every frame, which means our stickers can dynamically respond to lighting changes, as you can see here. The turtle appears and disappears from the shadow as we flick the light switch on and off. You can see the flickering of the fire in Dustin's face, and you can actually take out a real flashlight and use it to reveal stickers that are placed in a very dark scene, which is a lot of fun. So now on to shadows. As I mentioned, our image-based lighting model doesn't account for light occlusion, so there are no shadows. But shadows are really important in general, and especially so for AR because they provide a really powerful disambiguating clue about object height versus depth. They avoid the appearance of things kind of floating in midair. And so we really wanted to have some way to capture that. Here you see what happens when all we do is just change the shadow without changing anything else. So our initial shadowing implementation was called Blob Shadows, and it was designed to produce smooth, low-frequency shadows. We put a shader on ground planes, combining 2 layers of shadow estimates, both of them based on the skeletal animation joints, which were sort of a quick proxy for a sparse set of points covering the interesting parts of the sticker. So there's the so-called base layer, which has the least detail, and a contact shadow layer, which has a little bit more. And together, these do a nice job of simulating sort of almost like ambient occlusion shadows under uniform lighting. So here's how we implemented this. First, artists would designate some specific animation joints as contributing to these shadows, because not all the joints were necessarily relevant. The base shadow is just an ellipse covering the shadow joints projected onto the ground plane. And the contact shadow treats each joint as a tiny sphere and darkens the ground plane based on estimated projected solid angle of that. So it's like a single pass approximation to ambient occlusion, strictly limited to the ground plane. But single pass is important because we really wanted to avoid doing multi-pass rendering on these mobile devices. Here's what the final blended result looks like on the right. As you can see, it's quite a nice effect. Now, in addition to that, we also wanted to capture the more detailed shadows from a strongly directional light source, like the sun, even though we didn't necessarily know what that direction would be, but it was decided that having that detail as just for the purpose of grounding things was better than not having it. So for that, we used what are called exponential shadow maps based on a 2008 Year Graphics paper. And the basic idea behind these is that you render exponentiated depth into the shadow map, observing how the exponential curve kind of resembles the step function that forms the depth test of regular shadow maps. By incorporating this depth test directly into the shadow map itself, we can directly filter it, which is a big win. Reason being that we can use hardware filtering to anti-alias and blur the shadow. We can use MIP mapping. We actually run a 2-pass blur filter to give these nice soft edges. And they're much less noisy and less prone to artifacts, like bias artifacts, than, for example, percentage closer filtering, which would be the traditional alternative. One common disadvantage of ESMs is light leakage, which is kind of the opposite problem from bias acne with regular shadows. But this never occurs on the ground plane because it doesn't require self-shadowing. It can occur in stickers themselves, but we actually didn't find that to be a big problem in practice. So the final shadows that we render here on the right combine the ESM shadow with the contact portion of our blob shadows and produce the effect that you see. You notice the contribution of the contact shadows to these little spots under the food emoji's feet, which create a nice effect. So we rendered the shadow maps for only objects that are reasonably close to the user. Beyond that, we smoothly blend them out and into the base component of the blob shadows. And this is really important to avoid degrading the effective resolution of our shadow map by forcing a really wide field of view. Otherwise, it would be a problem if we had lots of distance stickers scattered in a scene and the user were to walk from one to the other. We really couldn't afford to do multiple shadow maps because extra passes are so expensive. So now I'll go over some visual flair that we added to improve the look of our stickers. So we have this detailed camera feed image. Why not incorporate some of that into our reflections? Well, this is challenging because the phone camera actually makes a really poor light probe. There's a very limited dynamic range, very narrow field of view. And for most specular reflections, we can't really tell, from the camera feed, it's hard to tell what the incident light should be for any reflection. So our solution is to incorporate the camera feed only where it's plausible, which is at grazing angles, where the sources of the light rays are all more or less within the camera view. So we use the pre-computed cube map as the default, and we blend in screen space reflections at the grazing angles with a really sharp fall off. More specifically, we use this quintic term from Schlick's approximation to Fresnel reflectance as the fall off, which gives a nice realistic look to the fall off. Also, since the camera feed is generally darker than the cube map, we brighten it, but at the same time we avoid having the reflection be brighter than the camera feed pixels that it's based off of. So that's kind of a tone mapping operation. And finally, we blur the camera feed based on the surface BRDF in a similar way that we do for the cube maps through LOD biasing. So with all of that in place, here are some examples of this effect with shiny metallic stickers where the effect is most pronounced. It's subtle, but it adds a really nice touch when you notice it. Of course, camera feed refractions are the natural analog to reflections, and they're in some ways easier because most of the refracted rays do land within the camera feed. However, they do require a higher resolution camera MIP map just because you're actually showing all that information and it's potentially not going to be distorted depending on the geometry of a refractor. The good news is that we share this MIP map with Fibble as well as with the camera feed reflections, so we're only paying the price of building that MIP map once per frame. So we also wanted a low-cost approximation to subsurface scattering for our skin shader, and this models both multiple and single scattering in different ways. And so you can see the skin shader on the right in these images juxtaposed with the standard shader on the left. You'll notice the softer fall off and the reddish tinting that you get. So the multiple scattering broadens the diffuse BRDF by sort of further blurring the diffusely convolved environment, again using MIPMAP LOD biasing. We process the R, G, and B components of it separately using different biases, allowing the red to blur more into the dark areas. And this mimics the spectral variation of the mean free path with true subsurface scattering, where the red light penetrates more deeply into the object and scatters more into the darker areas. So the single scattering is a little bit more of a hack. It's modeled as a simple translucency effect driven by the camera feed, not the environment cube map. Since we lack proper occlusion, we limit it to very specific areas like earlobes through a texture, and we also limit it to silhouette edges through the shader. For Iron Man, we needed some really cool fire and smoke effects that would be hard to bake into his animations. So to accomplish that, we built a GPU-based particle system where the vertex shader generates particle billboards from a pre-generated mesh. The particles are lit with a simple textured shader composited using either additive or alpha blending, depending on the type. We prototyped this in Unity and then ported the shader to our system. So this actually shows some of the dedicated smoke and spark effects that we did for testing. Here I placed them into an old coffee machine. It would actually be nice to release a sticker pack with some of these effects and maybe call it prank emojis or something like that. So now for some concluding thoughts. Clearly, capturing AR on mobile is a tricky proposition. The lighting can be very unpredictable. Your CPU and GPU budget is limited by a lot of moving parts, the AR tracking, image stabilization, video encoding, ML, machine learning inference that you need for some of the contextual suggestions. And even if your hardware is fast enough to handle all of that at 30 frames per second, it's going to generate a lot of heat. And so you have thermals to worry about. You don't want your phone to start thermally throttling 10 or 15 seconds into your video. So some cheats are necessary, and that I've definitely covered a lot of them here. There's definitely a lot of room for improvement. But that being said, AR stickers and Playground have both been well received, both by tech articles and by our users, who have placed millions of stickers into their worlds, and they've captured millions of photos and videos along the way. So with that, I'd like to conclude this talk, and thank you for your attention. Thank you. So I'm not sure if we have time for any questions at this point. Okay. So yeah, if anyone has questions, I have a microphone here. We can pass it around. Sure. Thank you.
Hey, thanks. That was a really good talk. I was curious if you looked into, at the very end of all your rendering, any of the normal sort of like compositing, like if the image being too sharp to blur it or to match white points, or just sort of like Comp 101 if that stuff applies to like mobile AR.
Absolutely, that's a really good point. We do actually, we do some color correction and some tone mapping at the very end. We try to keep it as a single pass though, so once you get into things like blurring or adding operations that might require rendering into a separate target, doing multiple passes, we've shied away from that just because it adds to the expense. And it's actually really painful because I feel like the hardware is capable of doing a lot more than what we're doing with it for the rendering, but we have to reserve so much of the capacity for all the other stuff that's happening. But yes, I would love to do more with that, and particularly things like depth of field, where we could make stickers integrate so much better into a scene if we could match the depth of field to the surrounding, real life imagery.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Hey, I was wondering if you could, or if there was an attempt to use the front and back-facing cameras to derive some sort of IBL lighting environment?
That's a really good question. We would love to do that. Unfortunately, that capability is not present in ARCore currently, and there may or may not be hardware limitations behind it, but certainly the more field of view we could get with multiple cameras, the better. And the moment that becomes exposed, we would love to use it. I mean, one option would be to alternate them or to do some sort of pre-capture, or even to encourage the user to move their phone around and rotate it in different directions. So those are all ways of maybe getting a better sense of the overall environment around you, and something we've thought about, but it could add a lot of friction as well. It's bad enough that you have to move your phone around to acquire the ground planes before you can do a whole lot. We didn't want the user to have to do a lot with the phone before they can start using this. But I have seen demos of some of Apple's work where there's a continually refining model of the environment based on the session as it progresses. So I think we should definitely consider something like that. Another question?
All right, one here, and then I think somebody over there. All right.
Hi, I was just curious what order, what operations you degrade when you're faced with lower quality hardware on the handset.
So currently we support the whole spectrum of Pixel phones, from the original 2017 launched Pixel to the Pixel 3. And on the original Pixel, we captured at a reduced resolution, I think 720. We may disable some of the ML models. I don't remember specifically which ones. But for the most part, things behave about the same. Unfortunately, you do feel quite a frame rate hit when you run it on the older Pixel phones. You're definitely not getting a smooth 30 frames per second, especially once you start video recording. But yeah, if we needed to support even lower end devices, we would probably have to start cutting more features. So far, we haven't.
Hi.
Hi.
Any thoughts on supporting AR glasses in stereo?
Not currently. I mean, we're really committed to mobile AR, but it's an interesting question. I think it would be fun. It would also be pretty challenging because now you'd have to be rendering in stereo, possibly at a higher frame rate in order to avoid nausea. So I think with our whole experience with Daydream, where we were doing true VR on Pixel phones, proved quite challenging. Even basic things like shadow maps were often out of reach just because we couldn't maintain the frame rate without thermal throttling from doing those basic things. So I think the hardware still has a ways to go before we can pull that off well.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Ivan.
Thank you.
Oh, that was a great talk. Interesting. Okay, so next, Paul Debevec will be talking about light fields and his work here in Google and so forth. So Paul is a senior scientist at GoogleVR. He's a member of GoogleVR's Daydream team, and he's an adjunct research professor at Computer Science in Vertebrae? Yeah, School of Engineering. Lots of stuff here to cover, but and obviously a lot of us know Paul from all the work he's done at USC and the light stages and the rest of it. So Paul will give his presentation on light fields, and then after he answers a few questions, we'll do a little interaction up here where we can do more questions, and then you're going to lead us over to another building where we'll see more interesting things. All right, thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Scott. Give me a moment to just hook right back up here. All right, and thanks, Ivan, for that fantastic presentation. And here we go. Do we have a slide? We have a slide. Excellent. Let's see. Again, Ivan, thanks for the great lead-in, covering things having to do a little bit with lighting. I think we're going to have a very light, heavy presentation here. Moving on. I was, as Scott mentioned, I used to work full-time at the USC Institute for Creative Technologies, which is actually just across a little park here, also in Playa Vista, and maybe some of you have been over to our little building over there. And one of the things that we had done over the years, again, as Scott mentioned, is build various light stages and such. And so in summer of 2016, myself and some members of our team, Graham, Fife, Shumingyu, and Jay Bush, had an opportunity to come to Google and continue with something we didn't know exactly what they wanted us to do. At the time, it was an exciting time for us because we were also in the process of finishing up a couple of light stage projects. We were scanning some actors for Blade Runner 2049, including these two actors who kind of merge into one kind of a morphed version of the two of them. Some work done by Double Negative for that. And then also something that we had to wait a while to see how it turned out. It turned out fantastically with John Nelson at the helm of the visual effects supervision of recording a couple of actors, Sean Young herself and kind of a younger actor, Lauren Pita, to be combined into producing a young version of Rachel for the end of Blade Runner 2049. And that, of course, won the Oscar last year for Best Visual Effects. And this year there's a nominee for Best Visual Effects, Ready Player One, that actually also used some light stage scans. There's some high-resolution detail that was recorded of the actors, including Ty Sheridan here, both to kind of draw on for their Oasis versions of them in the VR world, but also some pretty good digital stunt doubles that were done by Digital Domain. So here he is getting a scan. You might be able to make out Chloe Legendre there adjusting the headrest behind him in that scene. And then this is a really kind of a cool shot that starts as the real guy, and then he puts it on. Now he's a digital guy, and now here he goes into the VR headset. So they can kind of hand off between real and digital pretty effectively. And here we are in virtual reality ourselves too, working for GoogleVR. And it's been really exciting to join GoogleVR because, first of all, there's tons of cool people doing cool stuff at Google in all sorts of things, but there's also cool people at Google who are doing things in the area of computer graphics, in the area of computer vision, in the area of deep learning, all the things that we find exciting here. And Ivan is certainly one of the perfect examples with his rich visual effects history, now applying that in exciting new domains like augmented reality. We worked closely with some groups up in Seattle that was working on virtual reality capture technologies, things that use lots of cameras. And one of the nice VR capture devices they had is called the Yi Halo. It's a bunch of these kind of action sports cameras in a circle. The previous version was made using GoPros. Now this is using Yis, which are a bit higher resolution. And it basically shoots an omnidirectional stereo image once it processes through the jump stitching pipeline. And then if you have a VR headset, you have 360 degrees all the way around. You can see stereo no matter which way you look. And Google Daydream also works on VR headsets as well. You've probably all used a Google Cardboard, maybe even the kind of the cloth, somewhat nicer version with the controller called the Daydream View. Sort of the top end one that we have out right now is called the Lenovo Mirage Solo. It's a partnership with Lenovo, and it incorporates the Daydream operating system, so you can download apps or watch YouTube VR. And it even comes paired with this really cool little camera that's got two 180 fisheye lenses, and it will take stereo photos that will then be viewable in your VR headset. And you can actually see stereo, and if you kind of look there and suspend a little disbelief, you can almost believe you're actually there. It's a pretty exciting form of photography. Something that's also really cool about the Lenovo Mirage Solo is it has these two cameras in the front, which are used for positional tracking. So it can actually know not just how you're turning your head, which is most of VR, but like the higher end kind of PC tethered solutions, it also can track itself. And so it can adjust, if it's rendering CGI content, adjust the viewpoint as you move your head with low latency, and then that gives you yet another level of verisimilitude to the real world and believability that you're actually in this other environment. In fact, it also solves a major problem, which is that if you only have stuff that changes when you look around but not when you move around, that makes a lot of people a little sick to their stomachs. It certainly does for me. And that's a great advance, but then there's actually a bit of a mismatch, which is the kinds of content that you can shoot with a Yi Halo or the little stereo camera that you can get with the Lenovo Mirage Solo is really rendered from or stitched together from one particular point of view, or like one for your left eye, one for your right eye. And it's photographic content you can't move around in the scene. And you'd really love to be able to do that with 6 degrees of freedom. And the idea that one could have is, well, maybe what we'll try to do is capture enough of the rays of light coming into a whole volume of space so that we can then render any view that you need within that volume. And that's the idea of a light field. And in fact, I got invited by a little workshop at Stanford in early 2015 to speak on the topic of light fields, and certainly we'd used light fields over our work over the years, even with some of our light stages at USC. But since it was early 2015 and you couldn't talk to anybody without having some discussion about virtual reality, it seemed like the thing to end the talk with would be, well, how do light fields apply to virtual reality? How would you record a light field in some way that you could then show in a VR headset and see in every direction, and then also be able to move your head, at least enough, like if you're sitting down, all the directions you'd want to move in. So this was early 2015, and this was the idea of actually shooting video with like a whole sphere of GoPros or something like that, and then try to process that in some way that it would show up in a VR headset. Yeah, it's a bit of an ambitious vision. But when we got to Google, it turns out this is one of the things they wanted us to work on. And the result that I can talk about today so far is an app that we've released on Steam. That's like a VR download store that actually lets the user put themselves inside various light fields and then experience them. And so what I'll be able to talk about right now is some work that I've collaborated with some members of our San Francisco office, Ryan Overbeck, Daniel Erickson, and Dan Evangelikos, as well as a number of our Playa Vista team members that you'll hear about more later, to basically have a relatively convenient way to go out and shoot light field still photos and then bring them into virtual reality and render them in real-time stereo 90 frames per second and hopefully feel like you're really there as much as VR can possibly do that. All of these images that you're seeing here are actually rendered in virtual reality and our virtual camera moves through the light fields. So as I mentioned, light fields have been around in the field of computer graphics for quite a while, and there's been other projects with light fields. 1996 was the big year where light fields hit the SIGGRAPH conference, and there were a pair of papers by Mark Lavoie and Pat Hanrahan, and also Gortler et al. Called the Lumograph, that sort of both broke the news about you take lots of images over a plane and then you can generate new views behind or in front of the plane using that. Mark Lavoie is actually at Google as a distinguished scientist in the GCam group, coming up with fancy algorithms in the Pixel phone like the night sight mode and HDR Plus that give you amazing quality images even in low light. I actually got to be part of a light field project with Otoy back in 2015 as well, and you can see Jules Urbach from Otoy in an old DK2 headset enjoying a photographic light field taken with a particular rig there. And of course, we also followed the work by the really cool company Lytro, including from when they made their pivot from sort of like little miniature light fields that you'd shoot for refocusing purposes that are all the rays of light that come into the front of a camera lens, to actually their pivot to VR, building arrays of cameras to try to capture all of the rays of light coming into a large area, which they did in the middle of 2015 as well. And we tried to do something a little bit different than all of these previous projects, in particular to try to design a light field capture technique that was pretty quick and pretty convenient, and we could actually take to lots of interesting places and get some nice light fields to share with the world. And the device that we came up with was actually repurposing a GoPro Odyssey 360 stereo rig. So what you can see here, this is a Jump Odyssey 360 stereo camera. It is done in a collaboration with Google, where GoPro found a way to really accurately synchronize 16 GoPros together, and you can all start and stop them with one button press, which is convenient. And we simply just took the GoPros and their backpacks out of that, put them into a new 3D print done by Jay Bush, who you'll meet later in her fabrication laboratory, and a motor drive system developed by Shu-Ming Yu, who you'll also meet later today. And we made this little thing that we called, not the GoPro Odyssey, but since it's a little different, we called it the GoPro Oddity. And this was designed so that we could basically take it down pretty quickly, put it in one Pelican case. It doesn't need all 4 SIGGRAPH Asia paper authors to set it up. You can do it with one person, but you can see, at least if you speed it up, it goes pretty quickly. So there we are, taking it out of the case, and then it's going to do a little spin. It either does 1 or 2 spins, depending. If you take a long exposure photograph of the thing spinning around and you don't turn the power lights off, then it actually kind of gives a nice little long exposure photo that shows the path that's traced out. I can't tell you where the exhaust port is in this thing, but one thing that you can notice is that there's actually there's like 16 cameras, but there's 32 rows of little LEDs here. And one thing that we implemented is actually a little bit of a drop string mechanism, so that as the cameras go around, if you set it up this way, they're that whole arc is very, very slowly dropping down. So the point after one rotation, it's dropped about half of the distance between the camera lenses. So if you want to shoot a double resolution light field vertically, which you might want to do if you have objects closer to camera, then you can just run it around twice and then effectively get 32 interleaved rows instead of just the 16 rows you'd get with one rotation. And then the other figure that you can see over here is basically, you know, the basic idea behind light field rendering. And the idea is that if you've shot photos that are out here, then you can generate views that aren't where the cameras were that originally took these photos. You can actually generate views inside the sphere if you've only taken photos on the outside of the sphere. And the observation is that the views that you need in order to generate these, all of the rays of light actually got recorded, not where you need them, but as they crossed into the periphery of this sphere. And since rays of light basically, you know, stay the same color and intensity as it goes through space, you can use pixels from this camera and some pixels from this camera and some pixels of this camera to make a collage image, a composite image of different pieces of your different original views and generate the perspective of the scene that you would have seen if you were right here, or using different parts of different camera views, the view that you would see here. Now, you might notice that some of the rays you might need come in between the cameras, and for that we use view interpolation techniques. Effectively, what we do is we run some kind of stereo correspondence algorithm between the views to get a rough depth map of the scene. We do this per camera, and then if we need to ask this camera what this ray of light is, we first project its image onto the rough model of the geometry out there, and then reproject that along the ray toward the view. So we're using a little bit of depth geometry in order to make the view interpolation smoother. If we had enough cameras, we wouldn't have to do that if it were very dense. So the other benefit of the thing, it's not all that big. And in fact, one design constraint that we had was to make sure that it would sit between the seats of kind of the most exciting object that we got to capture, which was Space Shuttle Discovery. We'd worked on a project with the Smithsonian Digitization Office a couple years before, and they were in the process of documenting Space Shuttle Discovery in the Air and Space Museum near Washington, D.C. And they literally, you know, got in touch with me and they said, would you like to come shoot light fields in the space shuttle? And I mean, of course, that's exactly what we want to do. So here is our oddity rig placed on a Bogan tripod in between the commander and pilot seats on the space shuttle there, and doing one of the rotations. So this rig is really fast, but of course the image quality is limited to that of which you can get from a GoPro Hero 4 camera. So we also wanted to come up with a way to do this with that isn't too much slower, that gets better quality imagery. And this is another thing with a lot of 3D prints and a drive mechanism from Jay Bush and Xiuming Yu, which we call the drop rig. And these are Sony Alpha 6500 cameras with Rokinon 8mm lenses that get about 140-degree field of view, which is nice. And there's just one motor that spins it around, and the thing uses that string mechanism to kind of slowly lower itself as it goes around. And there's two cameras if you want to go faster, so you can basically start the two cameras on the equator, and then as it rotates, then one of them goes down, one of them goes up, and it'll spin around. You can see the string unwinding here. Kind of works. I think maybe Matthew Duvall shot this video there. And then if you do a long exposure photo and we just put like a red LED on one camera and a blue LED on the other, then you can see it traces out a pretty good path for things. In this mode here, it's actually starting and stopping the camera. So it'll stop it, take a picture, stop it, move it, stop it, take a picture. So it leaves a bit of a brighter spot where it dwells for that. And that's if we're going to shoot HDR, because some of our scenes, you know, there's some nice reflections we'd like to capture. And so here we are in the cargo bay of Space Shuttle Discovery. This is sped up, of course, but basically we shoot an HDR image with minus and plus 2 exposures for for each of those shots. So we have a lot more latitude in tone mapping afterwards. So those are our two rigs. The first one can go in like a minute or two. The second one, depending on if we're doing a start-stop or not, can take between 10 and 40 minutes. And sometimes you have that amount of time with your scene and you can get higher resolution imagery. So once we have these images, and it's about 1,000 images that we get over the sphere, we have to figure out exactly where they were taken from. And our devices are made with some level of precision, but in the end, we end up running some computer vision techniques that look for feature points and then do a random samples consensus to bundle adjust exactly where the cameras are. And this is a solve for one of our rotations that we have. And so now we have all these set of views on the sphere, and we would like to then create, virtual camera moves within our scene to show, people anywhere they move their head in VR exactly what it would look like from that left eye position and that right eye position. And hopefully our views will look, at least this kind of quality as if you're actually moving back and forth. And you even want things like, reflections to look pretty good, view-dependent reflection effects. So there's some reflections here that you can see in the screens actually shift around. So it's not just the appearance of like, photo-mapped flat texture geometry for that. Now, if we did just use, say, one of the photos that just saw the front of the flight deck here and project it onto some geometry, you could use that kind of in a camera projection image-based rendering technique to move the viewpoint back and forth. And this would probably look, somewhat useful to see in VR. But you'll notice that when you get around an occlusion, you'll see like a lot of stretched triangles here because it didn't see around the edges or such. And you'll also notice that the reflections just stay stuck on these screens. So you don't really get the sense of like which parts are shiny and which aren't. And there's all sorts of other things in here like these plastic dials and the different lusters of other materials that you'd like to communicate properly in VR. So the idea is that we'll still use this camera's pixels projected onto this geometry to make up part of the light field, but we'll only use it for the part of the light field that's basically along the same directional rays that the camera originally saw toward where you're viewing it from. And in this particular case, that's just going to be these rays here. So as we move back and forth, we're going to imagine that that camera turns into like a little kind of ellipse of pixels, and we'll see through what that camera had to say about the scene as we look straight past that one particular camera. For the other areas, we're going to use pixels from different cameras. In fact, if we show most of the pixels that we're using from all the cameras as we translate around inside here. Right now we're like in the middle of the flight deck and we're kind of doing a little circle going around that's about 2 feet in diameter. You can see that each one of these ellipses corresponds to one of the original camera positions that we solved for. And then as we move around, different parts of the scene kind of flow past the pixels that are used for each one of those different camera positions. And so this reflection is going to move around because it's going to be brought in from different cameras as you rotate around and move around in the scene. So if you then just take all of those little disks, expand them out a little bit so you get a continuous image, do some nice blending between that, then the final result looks something like this. So here we're obviously spinning around, but since we're back behind the center from where everything was shot, we're actually translating within the scene as well. And I like this particular scene because even though I did get to go in there to run the cameras, we were kind of stressed and really busy, and there wasn't too much time to think about how cool it is to be being in the flight deck of a space shuttle that's flown 39 times. But now, anytime I want, I can put on the VR headset and I can just kind of drink it in one more time and just think about how cool the whole thing is. And we were advised not to flip the switches. We were asked not to flip the switches while we were in there. We were told it would be tempting. Apparently, good question. Apparently, they're all in a particular like as if you were to land it. This is how you would put the switches if you were going to land it. I think is how they have it set up. When astronauts visit, they get to flip the switches. Then they can show people about that. So one thing about light fields is that it's a lot of images, which is a lot of pixels, which is a lot of data. And so we need to render this stuff at 90 frames per second. We don't want to have to deal with 1,000 high-resolution images all the time. So there's actually a compression technique that Ryan Overbeck has been working to actually get some modifications made to some of the existing VP9 and AV1 codecs to do tile decoding, which allows us to render these light fields a lot more efficiently. And the basic idea is the observation that to render any particular view at a given moment, you don't need all the pixels of all the images. You only need some of the pixels of all the images. So if you can leave the images compressed and only decompress mostly the pixels that you actually need to create this image at one given time, then you can render the thing in real time. So if you take a look here, this is an image which we've encoded in terms of tiles. So any one of these tiles, the way the codecs are, then you can go and decompress just this tile or just this tile. And as we move back and forth, the pixels that we need from just this camera are going to be the ones that overlap this particular ellipse. And so the only data that you actually need to decompress for this one view is this set of tiles here. And you do have to do that number of tiles for all the different views, and they do overlap quite a bit, but it's still way better than having to decompress all the images all the time, and you don't have to worry about that. The light fields that we have so far compress to about 50 to 100 megabytes, which is tractable. It's still not as small as we'd really like it to be, but that gets you about 15 pixels per degree over the whole sphere with about 2/3 of a meter to a meter of head volume. So this was a great subject to take a look at for the space shuttle. We also brought onto the project one of our favorite people, virtual reality photographer Greg Downing, who's from X-Res. He's over in the audience here today too, so feel free to say hi to Greg later. Yay, Greg. And we wanted his help to try to figure out what are other great things to take pictures of around here in Los Angeles that would make good light fields. And so he helped us get to the Gamble House in Pasadena, which, as you know, was like Doc Brown's house with the DeLorean in it for a couple of exterior shots in Back to the Future. Some other a really cool mosaic tile house in Venice, which has lots of different materials. And then we also realized toward the end of the project we wouldn't really have explored everything we could with this new form of photography if we didn't take some pictures of people. So we actually did one final shoot back at the Venice Mosaic Tile House, and we asked the artists of the Mosaic Tile House. This is, I think, on Palms Boulevard, and on Saturdays, if you Google or Bing, whatever, the Mosaic Tile House in Venice, I think on Saturday you can buy a ticket and get a tour of it. It's gorgeous place inside and out with all these like pieces of ceramic and mirrors and such. And these are Sherry Pan and Gonzalo Duran who have been doing this work. So Greg had reached out to them. We got some light fields at their house, then we went back. We should get a light field of them too and try to do a portrait of them. So here's our oddity rig. We knew they'd have to basically stay still for about 30 seconds, and they were up for doing this here. They're cool folks. But then we had this problem, which is that where do we tell them to look? Because normally you say, oh, okay, we're going to take your picture, just look at the camera, and then here we go. So here there's lots of cameras, and they're moving. And the first thought was that, okay, put a little piece of pink tape on the center of the rig and have them stare at that while the thing goes by. It's a little bit hard because like cameras are going to like try to distract you as it goes there. But they were able to do that. And then you get these light fields, and it kind of looks like, if you're right in the middle of the lights field, it looks like they're looking at you. But then if you do this, it's like now they're looking over here, they're looking here, and it's kind of like, you know, it's a bit of a weird effect. It's sort of like they're kind of just frozen, and it's a little creepy, and they're not paying attention to you. So we thought of another thing to possibly do, which is not to look at the pink tape here, but look at the green tape here, which we have a piece here, we have a piece across the front of it and on the other side. And the first thing, it's actually way easier to look at the green tape because nothing passes in front of it. And once something's moving, your eyes just kind of naturally want to track it anyway. So they're just trying to stay still. And then when the cameras start being like on their half plane, then they kind of watch the thing go ahead there. And then they can kind of like blink at the very end. So the result is that all of the photos get them looking back at the camera. And so no matter where you go, you actually get the effect that they're looking back at you. So while the previous effect was kind of creepy, this is a different way to be also kind of creepy. And I personally think the better way to be, kind of creepy as well here. It's pretty neat. So again, try this out in the demo if you can. I think it's a better way to do portraiture. Of course, another form of portraiture is self-portraiture as well. And so we thought maybe we should have the Oddity rig get a self-portrait too. So at the Venice office of Google, sorry for the little tearing there, but at the Venice office of Google, there's actually an Airstream trailer out back. And on Wednesdays, you can sign up to get a haircut in there. So that's why they have a mirror inside the Airstream trailer. And we put it right in the middle in a way you could see the mirror. And what happens is that as you move your head back and forth, you basically become the light field rig. And if you move to the right, it moves to the right. If you move to the left, it moves to the left. And it kind of shows you which rays of light it's actually using to produce the images that you get, because it's basically always using the cameras that are right along your field of view. And another one that some people say is their favorite one is another idea that Greg had, which was to shoot a kind of a famous stained glass window at St. Stephen's Church in Granada Hills. This stained glass window was originally on display in like a 1956 World's Fair, and now it's installed in this church. And we shot it in the late afternoon, so the sun's actually behind the panes of glass. And unlike normal VR panorama or stereo thing, as you move back and forth, you can actually put the sun behind different panes of glass and watch it turn different colors and kind of bring it to life a little bit more. So the nice thing about this is that there is an app. It's publicly available. It's free. So anyone who has a Vive or has a Oculus Rift or Windows Mixed Reality, and you have the Steam VR system installed, you can download Welcome to Light Fields. And it's got about 35 light fields in it. It has like a 7-minute narrated experience. And we'll be running excerpts of that in the demos over in our other building. A couple of things that we're kind of finishing up with or continuing in some of the work. You can actually make light fields of synthetic scenes, not just photographed scenes as well. And you might want to do that if you have a scene that like has a expensive rendering algorithm, so you're doing something in V-Ray or Arnold, even if you're using like some nice cloud services to get it all rendered, it still takes a while, maybe too slow to put it into virtual reality. Well, you can render all of those shots kind of just like we do this here, and Jay Bush, I think, fired off this rendering, and then we ran it pretty much straight through our regular light field pipeline, and it produces a global illumination computer-generated scene that you can move around in interactively and see in VR, and it really helps bring that kind of scene to life. We've worked to try to continue to expand the diameter of what we can record with the light field. So the latest rig that has a lot of JBush 3D prints on it here and carbon fiber, we can kind of put arbitrary length tubes in here, and we've gotten even to about 2 meters in diameter. We find that like, if people are going to be sitting down, then you can kind of just be in a 1 meter diameter area. And then we've also been working on light field video too. So we kind of took 2 GoPro Odysseys and hooked them together and made a plane of cameras here. Matt Whalen here took it out to the beach. I think Jason Degarian was helping him out. And we got some of a lifeguard there, and then this is some of the LMU fountain. And you can play it back even in a mobile headset and look around. And Toni is telling me it's time to wrap up. So with that, I am going to say thank you. And there's a couple of websites down there and many, many people to thank for the presentation. But thank you very much. OK. And I'll welcome back Scott.
So, Paul, why don't I have you and Ivan come on stage here, just so that we can keep moving here. And I think you'll probably have a few questions from the audience in terms of light fields after that excellent presentation. So, over here, Toni.
Hi, Paul. Hi. So I work a lot with storage and memory systems in the tech field, startup world. And I'm curious, what kind of memory bandwidth are you using now, and what are you looking for in the future as this field grows?
Well, that's a great question. So there's people I work with who could drill down way deeper than I can in this, but there are significant needs for memory bandwidth, just generally because it's lots of imagery. And also the particular way we're doing this right now is that the modified versions of the video decompression codecs actually only run on the CPU. They're not implemented in hardware yet, although hopefully soon. That would be great. So basically, we have to keep a lot of the data on the CPU before it gets decompressed and then sent up to the GPU for that, and then that's a source of a certain amount of bandwidth. So I think if you take the resolution of each eye, multiply it by about 4, multiply by 90 frames per second, then that's what we're looking at.
In the center there, let's.
Clearly, you're assembling these from a lot of rays going in different directions at different times, and if there must be some kind of averaging you're doing to keep the. I mean, you're here and you have to use that ray, and then you're over here, and all of a sudden you have to use this ray, which is between cameras, and there's a natively discontinuous kind of function here. How do you make that smooth?
Yeah, great question. So there's two things, one of which is projecting onto the geometry. So even though this image, and the next image over to the right show different views of the scene, so if you kind of popped from one to the other, you definitely notice a seam between them. This image projected onto rough geometry of the scene, and this image projected onto rough geometry of the scene kind of stabilizes it so that the pixels are at least mostly in the same place. And then on top of that, we're doing quadrilinear interpolation between all the different views. Or basically, what happens is those disks, when the disks overlap, it figures out for every final pixel, we expand the disk so that there's no cracks between them, and then it figures out which disks, which cameras overlapped it, figures out a weighted average to take so that if you're just about to go outside somebody's disk, you weight down to 0, and if you're closer to the center of the disk, you have a stronger influence on the final thing, and that gets rid of most of it. If you do look closely in the demo, you will be able to see little things that seem to be more lively than they should be, though.
Okay.
Hi, then. I'm working with a headset technology that's basically the equivalent of Google Cardboard, but for AR. Would it be possible to take on a software level everything that you're doing, but eliminate the background totally, and just have the sticker that would be superimposed over reality instead of on my screen?
Yes, I mean, that's definitely sounds doable. So is it like a pass-through type of
It's
AR?
like wearing Pepper's Ghost on your face. Your cell phone sits like this and shoots straight down onto a mirror, which bounces up to an optical surface and shoots the light straight out.
Well, it's definitely an interesting idea. Yeah, we should chat about that.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I did have a question in terms of playground and so forth. Is any of that tech going to roll into AR Core or be available to other developers and things?
I think the short answer is yes. I can't really speak to the details at this point, but there's definitely more work being done with things like light estimation, and there are further improvements coming with segmentation. And in fact, the whole rendering engine that we're using is being very actively worked on, and I would be surprised if many parts of that didn't find their way into AR Core.
Oh, great, thanks. And for you, Paul, I guess the question is, will, like your codecs and the other things and the formatting for light fields, will that be all released at some point, you think, or?
Yeah, Ryan's continuing to work on getting this kind of released in hardware implementations of 81. And at that point, then a lot of things you would want to do with light fields become a lot easier and a lot more tractable for that. And we're still interested if somebody has an idea for like a killer light field to shoot, then we have the rigs. We'll be able to show you the rigs when we go over there. Let us know. Maybe that's something we could help capture, and then maybe get it into some future release of the demo.
Great, excellent.
Hi there. I'm a big fan of depth cameras and all the various techniques that are used. And my first experience with a handheld device was from Google Tango using a time-of-flight camera. And I still have one, and it's like having a magic trick in my pocket. But the Tango, I don't know whether they deprecated the actual depth camera sensor. Were there any hooks in there? I saw one of your slides saying that ignore the depth sensor. So Google was on the depth sensor bandwagon. Initially, they kind of got the ball rolling, and then they dropped off. And all of my my market analysis work is showing that depth cameras are being added to Apple products and almost all the other smartphones that are coming, various configurations of depth cameras that will be utilized for AR and for feature tracking and the like. How does the team at Google think about sort of getting back on the bus with depth cameras that are going to be adopted on most of the major platform phones, if not on the Google phone? And how does that help you or save time doing all the laborious analysis and SLAM and structure and motion, the other thing you're doing with just a camera, like a regular camera?
That's a really good question. So with respect to Tango, I don't know sort of the marketing decisions that went behind that becoming deprecated, but it definitely is deprecated. As far as the work that Apple has done, my understanding is that their depth is on the inward-facing camera, and so that's very useful for capturing your face and so forth. And that is, I think that is an area that's going to continue to grow. With respect to the outward-facing camera and being able to capture the depth of an entire room, I don't know that that's an area that's going to grow. That appears to require a lot more hardware, bigger, beefier phones, closer to what the Tango phones were like, and it seemed like the trend was going away from that. But I honestly don't know. Perhaps that will make a resurgence as well. But I think the focus now is on basically capturing the face of the user and doing a lot of interesting things with that. And I do believe that Google will have something to show with that as well in the future.
Just add something. This past CES, that was sort of the hidden news about CES, that Sony's new depth sensor is going to be put in all Apple tablets and all the Apple phones coming within a year. So, and many, many other device manufacturers are also adding the depth cameras. Probably, they were excited by what Google did, and it's just a little bit more extra time, more power efficient sensors that don't require too many extra little moving parts. So it looks like that's where it's going.
I would certainly like for that to be the case, because there's so much more that we could do if we could capture a reasonably accurate point cloud of an entire scene.
So I have a question for Ivan. So how large is the team involved in Playground and things like that?
So the Playground team, it's actually grown a bit recently because there was a group in the San Francisco office that has joined us. But it started out rather small, I would say, probably maybe 8 of us or so working toward the original AR stickers launch. And then there were other groups within the same management chain that were doing other projects that eventually got defragged and moved all into Playground. And at this point, we're, I'd say, probably 20 to 25 engineers strong. And we also have artists collaborating with us and UX people. So by Google standards, it's a fairly large team, I would say.
Okay. And Paul, how many people are involved in the Lightfield team?
You're going to meet a lot of them today.
Okay.
So we have our small, I guess, like 12-ish person group here, which actually isn't just doing light fields. We're doing a couple of other things with that too. And then our 3 buddies up in San Francisco.
Okay.
So it's
great.
Relatively small, focused effort, and that's generally how Google will do things. Is that while technology is still being kind of researchy, developed, in development, in exploration, keep the teams very small, and then when they're ready to scale something, then throw people on it.
Okay, great. Okay, Toni?
No, go ahead.
Oh, no,
Thank you. I have a question about blending the light probe or light field probes. I kind of understand how that works for a photo, but when you're doing video and you're looking over here and then you're looking over there, does it have to interpolate across time, kind of? Because, I guess, can you speak a little to that?
Yeah, so I mean, pretty much thinking about video compared to stills is that you're just doing the stills thing at 30 frames per second. Of course, you want to, I mean, ideally you would do 90 frames per second because that's what the the VR headsets tend to update at, or 75 or 120 or whatever it is. But being at a high frame rate, that's probably a little too much to deal with. So if you just advance time, new content 30 times per second, but still adjust the view, so as you're turning around or changing your viewpoint, that adjusts at 90 frames per second, that kind of works. If you just simply like are looking over here, nothing that we're doing needs any eye tracking at this point. So, you know, we're rendering the entire image that you've got. If you turn from here to turn from here, then the image that can be rendered at any given time is, you know, good and omnidirectional. You can render it for any field of view that you would need. So there isn't like a fundamental problem that would make it difficult to look from here to look from here. It's just like every single frame is a time moment where you want to render it from the right position with the data from the most recent time.
I see. And then also, you were talking about the volume is about 1 meter. So that means it's that the effect only really works if you're within 1 meter of that original capture point?
Yeah,
Are you able to take multiple sort of site readings and then blend between them?
We've done that a couple of times. So yeah, right now, you know, one of the drawbacks is it's not a room scale experience, which would be like cool if it were. But then figuring out how to make the camera swing around in a kind of a spherical path, but then get to all the corners of the room is a little challenging. So right now it's about as far as you can like lean, for the ones that we take today, lean without falling out of or knocking over your chair. So that kind of works. And what we have done is like sometimes we'll shoot one here, we shoot one here, we just render them both at the same time, and then just kind of naturally when you're outside of this one, instead of like kind of fading to black, you're just in the other one already, and it's like, yeah, it's just a continuation. It's even more fun if you take light fields of different locations and kind of like plunk one here, one here, one here, one here, and then you can kind of like be in the space shuttle over here, and now, oh, I'm in the Gamble house, and now I'm over forward, and you can do some fun with that.
That's awesome. All right, thanks.
So, Paul, would it be possible to combine both the spherical and an array type of light field?
I would love to take that slide, you know, from 2015 and actually build that out. And you know, again, kind of in the spirit of, you know, keep things small until you're really ready for it. You know, we've been focusing on things that use fewer cameras because it starts getting complicated to deal with all. I personally don't want to have to take out all the micro SD cards on that thing.
Right. I hear you.
Which I had to change in the mid deck of the space shuttle with like all these like you know, platforms with like little cracks in there. It's like, don't add to the artifact here. Avoid.
So I'm told time is up. We do have demonstrations. Thanks again to Toni and our guest.